Everybody. Welcome to Tanya Talks. I'm your host, Tanya Ricketts, for this evening. And today we are going to be having a wonderful conversation. I'm joined today with Dr. Silvia D'Addario, who is a human rights activist, a spiritual innovator, and a systems thinker. Today, Silvia is going to be speaking to us about change making for human rights, inclusion, leadership, equity, and creating social change. So thank you, Silvia. Welcome this evening.
Yay, thanks so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Yes, I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Me
It's a
too.
loaded conversation. It's a necessary conversation. And I'm happy to be a part of it with you in order to. Sylvia has educated me so much in this area, and we've had some very enlightening and thought-provoking conversations in this area. So
That's
we
for
challenge each
sure.
other on how we can be a part of the change in a very positive way. So I want to start off the conversation just by asking you if you can help us with our audience, just really explain what it is that change making is.
That's a good place to start. And it's a pretty simple concept. I mean, change making is really about taking intentional action to create positive social impacts. Cut and dry. I think, where it becomes a little more interesting is to note that I think that we all have a responsibility to create social change in a variety of ways. And so I'm sure we'll talk about personal growth and what that means to create positive change for ourselves. And then also where that intersects with social change outside of us.
Right.
And
Because
so
when
a
I
lot
think
of
of it for me personally, I think to myself, it's just such a huge topic that it almost is so overwhelming that you almost shut down. And as much as you want to be somebody that's an individual that can affect change and you want to do your part, all of a sudden it's with all the injustices of the world, and there's so much injustice going on in so many different areas of life. It's like, which do you choose? What do you do? And how rooted is it? How far back does it go? It almost feels heavy, like you're taking this big weight on your shoulders. And then for me, I can only speak on behalf of myself. All of a sudden I get deflated, I shut down, and I numb out
Yeah.
because it just feels so big. And what you've helped me be able to do personally is be able to simplify it and break it down into little pieces, that all of a sudden I could breathe and say, okay, I can do that. I can do my part in this. So thank you very much for even helping me be able to pick it apart and say, this is what I can do. And that's what our intention is this evening, is to have you share all those little nuggets that you gifted me with in order to do my part in being a part of the social change. So where do we
Oh,
begin?
I'm so glad to hear that.
Yes, that's what was all thought provoking, right? It was nice. So
Well, and I think part of what you have helped me grapple with as well is where that personal work intersects with that broader intention to do good in this world, right? And so you're right, it can be overwhelming. Where do you start? How do you and you said that, like, how do you then prevent from numbing out? And I think that's where that real intersection of being present, being mindful, really doing a lot of that deep healing work with ourselves and knowing where we stand post with doing that bigger work outside of ourselves, and
right.
ensuring that it's not more detrimental
Mhm.
to our communities and to the people that we're trying to support than it is. And I think that that's a really tricky point that we're probably going to cover, is a lot of times our intentions to do good in this world can actually really reinforce some of the uglier parts of humanity. And I think that's where we really need to take a step back and look inside and say, how does my power, how does my privilege actually reinforce bigger pieces like systemic bias, a lot of those isms like racism, homophobia, right? I think a lot of us never have the intention to create negative impact, social impact. But the interesting thing is that a lot of times when we're not mindful, of, where we stand and, what our actions are, then we actually do create those negative impacts.
Right, right. It's interesting when what strikes a chord with me is, when you say we begin to heal, and as a coach and as a motivator myself, I know that when I think about it, and we had the opportunity to talk about it, was that, one of the simplest way for me in my own profession that I can show up to help dismantle a lot of the unhealthiness with individuals is really to show up and allow them to bring forth their experiences, those painful experiences, those hurtful experiences, those traumatic experiences, their real life, everyday experiences and challenges that they're faced with, and not cause them to just get over it or just deny it or just move on from it, but really hold that space for them to work through it. And once we work through that aspect of it, then we can start to progress, move to the next level of it. So that is just, the piece that I think that is missing in a lot of times is our lack of taking the time to understand what people are going through and to really listen to what the issues are.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and the interesting thing that I have come to learn is that a lot of the ways in which we see oppression perpetuate in this world really comes down to the everyday ways in which we treat ourselves, in which we reinforce that with relationships with other people. And so when we go unchecked, when our behaviors go unchecked, when our healing goes unchecked, we actually then work to reinforce a lot of the violence that we see in the world, a lot of the anger that we see in the world, the microaggressions, the tone policing, all of that is learned behavior, right? We think about, for myself, a big piece of learning has been how I have been taught as a woman to, check my own behaviors, to stay silent, to really fit the mold of what the expectations of gender look like for a girl and for a woman. And I realized that part of that internalized behavior is how sexism and patriarchy exist in the world, right? Like we talk about patriarchy like it's this big, massive system, but it requires everyday individual people to play the role and play the part. And so a lot of the ways in which I've learned to be small and be who I was expected to be supports that big system.
Right.
And also so does, we talked about this last week, when men are socialized in a toxic way, we call toxic masculinity, when there is no space for, emotional processing, for crying. And so those behaviors as well, right, unchecked, unhealed, support those bigger systems that really are harmful on a broader scale. So we can talk about the bigger picture, but the bigger picture only exists because of our everyday actions.
Right. It's interesting when you talk about playing small. So let's take it down to the individual. When you're taught and we're socialized to play small, and we can go into a lot of it happens mostly with females, but it happens just in general. It happens culturally, like you don't say that. And I remember, for me, anybody that ever knows me, is hence why Tanya talks, is I like to have conversation. And I've been always very comfortable sharing my experiences with people, with the intention that to show people that we are the same, we are going through the same thing, and we can go through it together. And if my story, has a positive impact in your life to help you get through something, then why not share the story? And I think it's that shame that sits within the story that we teach people, because I know growing up, to me, it was always told to me, you can't share that. It's right to share that. So all of a sudden the suppression starts. And but there's something that doesn't feel right, and it comes out in other ways, whether we overeat, whether we weight gain, and then the anger builds up, the hurt builds, like it stacks, and it's a rippling effect versus just allowing. So I feel that the individual work of healing ourselves is allowing us to accept the truth of who we are. And in that acceptance, we learn how to accept other people for who they are. So yeah.
That's beautiful. Absolutely. When I think, one of the biggest things that I've learned as an ally and as a person who believes in racial equality is I think a lot of us, especially white folks, have been taught from early on that it's uncomfortable to talk about things like race, and it's rude to talk about things like race. Like, you shouldn't notice that there is a difference. And I think a lot of that silencing is exactly why we are in this place where people feel really uncomfortable to notice that that systemic racism exists, and that the playing field has never been even for folks. And I think a big, talking about your role as a coach, I think one of the biggest things that I've grappled with is working with a lot of spiritual workers, a lot of coaches, a lot of healers, particularly who are white, who don't realize that there are racial dynamics between them and their clients that actually reinforce, that actually aggravate or make worse some of the trauma and some of the healing with which they're trying to support their clients through. And
Right.
I think part of this conversation is really important to, to take that conversation there is, how do coaches and healers and practitioners need to be more mindful of systemic bias at large? So like
Let's talk about it. Let's get into
yeah,
it.
well, I think it's really important, the idea that um,
What
that
are
there
what is that, like, one thing that a coach can do, like maybe incorporate into their practice that starts to be a part of the social change right before their eyes, one individual at a time.
Yeah, well, and that's a good question, because I think our friend Michelle asked that question in our comments. Thanks, Michelle, for dropping that question. What's the intersection of what we think about we create and the denial of people's lived experiences, particularly as a spiritual guide and a coach of mainly white women?
So this is
Um,
somebody writing in, by the way, guys.
Thank you. And there's a lot to that. And so we can unpack some of that. I think first and foremost, the recognition. I don't know that this is getting to Michelle's question right off the bat, but I just want to take a step back. But the recognition, I think practitioners first and foremost need to start that systemic bias does exist, and that things like racism are rooted in histories and legacies of mistreatment that stem back to enslavement and genocide. And so people often want to think that I learned this new term called modern racism, which is the idea that because Black folks are now participating in the labor market and in the labor force, that racism is no longer an issue. And I think I bring this in because I think that a lot of people and practitioners forget that that racism, and also we can talk intersectionally, right? So disability, sexism, all of those pieces, homophobia, really create real barriers for folks to get to where they want to go. And so if you're supporting somebody on their healing journey or on their wellness journey, like, first and foremost, we need to recognize that these aspects of our identity are real, and they can create real barriers for people to achieve their wellness goals or to achieve healthy outcomes or whatever it is around that. And I think that that's just, it would pause there, and I think that there needs to be space,
Right.
because I don't know that there is a ton of recognition to allow that to exist, and then to sort of factor in, well, as a white practitioner, as a white coach, how does the power that I hold, based on skin color privilege or class privilege, create a dynamic between me and my client? And is this something that we need to talk about? Because I think also something like that left unchecked can also be quite detrimental
The
when
overall
we
healing.
pretend that
Yeah.
it doesn't exist, that those
Right.
dynamics don't exist.
Right. It's interesting when you're talking about that. What all of a sudden came to my mind was my own personal experience growing up multiracial. In either my Oriental or white side of the family, I was considered blacker than black, and then in my black side of the family, I was considered whiter than white. And it was this, being a little girl, a state of confusion, a lot of disowning, a lot of abandonment, etc., that came with it. And going to school, my hair wasn't good enough. Wasn't born with good hair. I was criticized by black women that I always, the light skinned women always take their black. It was just like a vicious cycle I just, into the core of it all, I'd show up at school. People ask me, what was I? Not what's your name? Let's play. And at the core of it, for me personally, was I just wanted a friend.
Yeah.
Like, I didn't see anything, but I just wanted to be loved, and I just wanted a friend. So, I feel that, the opportunity that I have before me when I'm doing the coaching is remembering what it is that I needed. And when you talk about equality versus equity, and I'm not sure how much it ties in, but I just wanted the fair chance to show up like everybody else, not having that as being an issue of what was I because of my hair, my skin complexion, my nationality, confusion. I just wanted to show up having the same opportunity like everybody else to have a friend.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and that's I feel you and I hear you. And
It took a lot of work to go through that.
I know. And I want to take a moment too, because I think that we all have found ways to survive that pain and survive that in ways that, may not necessarily be healthy, because we didn't all grow up around very good role models, who modeled, good self-care or good boundaries or good emotional processing. So I'm really thankful that we can get to a point here in 2020 as women, as moms, as adults, and, as practitioners ourselves, who have not allowed that pain to override and overtake our drive to change the circumstances that I think have created that.
Right.
But I did want to tag back to that question of equality versus equity, which I think is a big one. And I think that a lot of people maybe don't understand what the difference is. Equality is really about providing everybody with the same tools. And it doesn't acknowledge that most people have different needs to succeed. So saying that we are all open and accepting of all people, but then not really equipping people with what they need to survive or to succeed is not equity work. And so when we strive to provide people with equal tools to succeed, we actually end up only creating an environment where some people can succeed. And so the difference is really, like, equity work is acknowledging that differences exist, that there isn't an even playing field, and that everybody requires, a level of accommodation or a different amount of space to process or different tools, right? Like, we wouldn't give everybody the same bike to ride in, a marathon, right? Like, if you're in a wheelchair, that bike is not useful to you. And so all of a sudden you cannot even participate, right? If you are a small person, that bike is not useful to you. And if you are a super tall person, that average bike needs to be accommodated to your size, right? And so the way we functioned in society up until this point is that we have assumed that, we need to treat everybody equally. And it's just, that's not the way to provide the best chances for people to succeed. And so if we are coaching people, if we are supporting people in some sort of way, we really do need to first and foremost understand what are the circumstances unique to you that will help you succeed? And I think that this is like, a page out of your book of coaching, right? I don't know that a lot of folks really recognize this. And then it gets complicated by when we factor in something like white privilege, which a lot of people get really get their backs up against, right? It's like, I grew up poor. There's nothing that, is privileged about me. And it's like, white privilege is not about being given, a certain amount of money or privilege, throughout your life. It's really about recognizing that as white folks, or, like this gets into light skin color as well, that there's a certain element of things that we have not had to worry about. Like I've never had to worry that I didn't get a job because of my skin color. That's white privilege, right? I don't worry that I'm 9 times more likely to be shot by the cops. That's white privilege. And so on and so forth, right? Like I am less likely to worry that my children, that somebody's going to call CAS on me and my kids. And that's white privilege. And so it's what I've been missing in my life and not necessarily what I've been given in my life. And
Right.
so that goes back to the notion of equity and equality, because when we think about working with people, especially, if you do have skin color privilege or light color privilege, then we need to think about the ways in which that factors into the dynamic as well.
Right. So when I think about all the coaches and practitioners out there today, it's like, to me, I think about it from a simplistic term of two people can show up with the same cut, and what they require to heal that cut is very different. And it's our job to show up and really navigate, show up, being present, first understanding and letting them communicate, or get to the point where they can communicate what it is they require to get through what that is. So we have to show up with not unfiltered, we have to show up with no biases, no preconceived notions, no theories, no book theories as to anything. Just show up and hold space and let them lead the show. And then from there, take it. And it's interesting because I'm going to throw a little bit of a curveball in here and bring up the whole idea of what we think we create, that was written into us, which is the whole manifestation piece. And I know in the years that I've done coaching, what I've been very upset about is this, airy fairy, oh, so you think it into being sort of thing. And then you mentioned, we had a very interesting conversation offline about the danger of that, because when people don't manifest what they want, they further beat themselves up and criticize themselves of, something's wrong with me. Why didn't that happen? Um, and really the healing process has to begin. I'm going to take it in a different direction and tie it back. However, it's no different than you working to, write down, what it is that you're looking to create, and you write it down in the present moment. But as you write it down, it doesn't feel real. Those are resistance. And that resistance is what you need to pay attention to, of what has to be healed within your soul before you can create space to manifest.
Yeah, I think the conversations around manifesting are completely oppressive. I think they're so toxic. And it isn't to say I don't believe in the spiritual practice of aligning yourself energetically with, what you desire, what your soul is calling for. But unfortunately, I feel like 90% of what I've read or what I've been exposed to around manifesting is, is really racist. It's really ableist. It's really, borderline patriarchal. And what I mean by all those things is it doesn't account for the privileges that some people have in life over other people. Like, it's a lot easier for some people to like attract certain things and certain opportunities over other people. And I think that's what I was saying before, is like, there is the presence of like systemic and unconscious bias out there. So you can want to manifest and create your dream job all you want. However, like it is scientifically proven that unconscious bias by recruiters and employers are more likely to choose, a resume with an anglicized name, or to choose the candidate who has lighter skin color or who is able-bodied, right? Like there's so much discrimination around people with disabilities and hiring. Like I'm just using the job as an example because everybody wants their dream job, right? And so this idea that somebody is going to manifest that over somebody else is completely not acknowledging the real barriers that people face in life to get from point A to point B. And so I don't think that resonates as a spiritual practice at all. I'm not saying that you can never get close or align yourself with the opportunities that you so desire if you do have a disability or if you are a racialized minority. But I think I'm coming at it from the perspective, again, as the practitioner who's just looking at supporting somebody and saying, well, you just need to manifest it. You just need to align yourself better with the energy source. And the worst is toxic positivity, where it's just like people are told that if they focus on these negative barriers, like if they focus on the fact that maybe discrimination exists, that they are then completely overriding any of that positivity that's needed to manifest.
Right.
And it's like, I can't sometimes when I read about this, like, if you stay positive, then you will be able to, get to your destination. And I think it's much more complex than that. And it goes
probably,
back.
I agree with you that it's probably much more complex. I'm a manifester, so I'll put it out there, guys, that I'm totally like, I love manifesting. I think it's fun. I think it's great. However, I will identify with the fact that, I was the one that wrote out the affirmations 500 times. And I was like, why isn't it happening for me? And I was thinking positively, and why isn't it happening for me? And as coaches, we need to really take it in steps, in my opinion. And I guess for me, because I've only experienced it in my own life, the whole manifestation process, but I think it was steps and the stages in the whole manifesting were the first step was the acknowledgement, the healing, the facing a lot of things and really working through that, because I believe in that energetic world that we create space. And, we will go down and know a whole other subject, which I'm fascinated with and excited about and I've applied in my own life. And yes, I've had the opportunity to do that. So I understand that. And as a coach, it's working through allowing people to create that space, taking off the backpack and unloading all that stuff that they're carrying, stuff that doesn't even belong to them, and really give them that space to heal their own soul through that, and emptying out the jar. We've got the full jar, and emptying out all that stuff out of the jar and creating space in there to create. And I do believe in the creation process from that perspective. How do we do it as practitioners? I think it's really understanding the steps that really have to be taken in order to get to that level of, okay, well, now that we've dealt with this aspect of it, and we can show up for the individual and what their needs are and help them work through it, then I'm not going to have the debate whether we're truly healed or not truly healed, but getting individuals to a point where they can have the hope to create the life that they should desire. How does that play out into certain communities? How does that play out in different, whether you're dealing with sexual bias, whether you're dealing with discrimination on any front, whether you're female, Black, Indigenous, how does that play out? That's a good question. I'm being very honest in this conversation. I can't answer that. I don't know. Right?
Well, that's what I mean. Like, I don't know that we have the answers, but I think about, the real lived experiences of, Black trans bodies that are continually exposed to violence. You think about people who are, in depths with mental health and living on the streets. Like, I wonder about those conversations about manifesting to, people who are exposed to trauma all the time. And I went to a very famous manifestors event last year. And this person's a white woman. And there was probably about 500 people who attended the event. And I think that there were maybe two, maybe three Black people in the audience, all white women, all white women. Um, and most of them, like I'm going to say the vast majority of them, like able-bodied. And so for me, when the conversation caters to a certain group of people who already have the means to create what they're looking for, I wonder about what the conversation is really about then, right? Like, do we not want like taking it back to human rights, right? Do we as a society not want dignity and access to basic human rights for everybody? Or like, would we rather manifest that golfing trip for ourselves and our partner? Like, what are we manifesting then? And so why are we manifesting wealth and abundance over, seemingly like dignified living experiences and opportunities for everybody? I also am thinking about like those pieces as well. And I think
We don't have answers for necessarily, but the awareness and the understanding, and bringing it to light to be able to have the opportunity to think about what we can do about it, I think is important. It's interesting because when you're saying that, and I'm thinking, okay, and I still take it back to what can I do? Because we've had this conversation offline, like, then I get overwhelmed, and I can only control what I can control. And I think
sure.
as practitioners or individuals, when I think about, how did you manifest this, and where it was only, three white women, three Black women in the audience, I think to myself, there is, in my own, and I can only speak off my personal experience, when I started to really do the work within my own soul to see how I was showing up, whether I started the process in my life when I was born, whether I was born into it, at some point it was up to me to wake up and start doing the work. And I'm not saying that everybody has equal opportunity to do that, so please understand that. Because then I often question myself. There's people that have made it through very, inhumane conditions and environments and wars and Holocaust, etc. But there was always a mindset that they had. To me, when I studied them, they were never present in that moment. They were always somewhere else. And I found that interesting. So how does that factor in? And again, I can't answer that. I can only say that they had a common characteristic, that they were never in that moment. They were always in another moment that ended up showing up anyways.
Mm-hmm.
And I know for myself, one of the things that it's important for me to do as a coach is to demonstrate to people their value and worth. And once they can understand what their value and worth is, so really do that work so they can see themselves to the truth and most powerful person that they are, the most loved, and they are an asset to themselves and the world. And getting people to that place that they're not self-sabotaging, and that they can change their thinking. But the changing of the thinking happens when the change of their heart, of how they see themselves, how they speak about themselves, starts to, you get so tired and fed up of thinking this way, being this way. It's like, why? So no matter how many affirmations you do, if you still have a different feeling about yourself, it's not going to show up. So how do we bring that to the communities? How do we bring that to people, for like not just communities? How do we bring that out there? How do we bring that forth?
Well, and I think that a lot of people get stuck on the messaging that they've internalized, rather than, the messaging that perhaps is closer and truer to their soul's calling. And I think that those are two completely different things. If you are attempting to access more wealth, and you want to do so by, gaining a massive following and, selling, products that, are X, Y, and Z. I think that that is more aligned with messaging that we've been brought up with around what success looks like, what abundance looks like, rather than peeling off the layers and understanding, what did I come here to do? What is my calling here? And I think, at least for me, if we are going to have like a much deeper conversation about aligning yourself energetically with purpose, then I think that it requires us to really take a very, very, very deep look at the ways in which, our behaviors and our desires reflect how we've understood who we ought to be in this world, rather than what actually resonates with us.
Right.
Because at the end of the day, I don't know that, that bigger purpose, that bigger calling, or that bigger energetic alignment, I don't think that it can happen in isolation to our community, in isolation to the people around us. And so, if what we're calling out into the universe is in alignment with ways that reinforce other people's oppression, right? And so, I'll give you an example. When I was doing my PhD, I focused my research on looking at the ways in which women negotiate paid and unpaid work, right? And so I started to look at women who wanted to um, really sort of liberate themselves from sexism, right? They wanted to be in the workforce. They didn't just want to be in the workforce like our moms. They wanted to be like executives. They wanted to make a lot of money, and they wanted to also be able to be moms. So how do you negotiate that? And so what I learned was that a lot of women, especially where we're from, hire domestic help. And they don't just hire domestic help, they hire racialized nannies to come to Canada and leave their families behind and to take care of their children at what amounts to, at the end of the day, probably about $2 an hour. These nannies are working 24/7. They only get paid 8 hours a day. Like, this is the live-in caregiver program before there were some changes. And so what I found at the end of the day is that there was a lot of women, and I'm going to say predominantly white women, who were looking to liberate themselves and find abundance by at the expense of somebody else's oppression. Does that make sense?
Absolutely,
And
yes.
so, yeah, you can manifest abundance, but if it's at the detriment of other people's dignity, freedom, opportunity, all of those pieces, then where are we moving? Like, how are we really liberating ourselves, especially as women? Like, is that feminism then, just because we can bring home a bigger paycheck in the 21st century, but it's at the expense of a racialized woman? And so I think, it really got me thinking about this work, this personal work, whatever the deep layers look like, can't be at the expense of other people. So when we're looking to manifest abundance, like, how are we looking to do that? Is it at the expense of somebody else? And so I think it brings us back to that question, is that, where do human rights and where does equity factor into that personal work? And I think for me, that's that piece, is that if we're really looking to do that deep work, we have to think about the impacts that our spiritual development has on other people around us.
It's interesting. I remember years ago, I had a client that came in, and she said something that resonated with me so deeply was, you know, impact versus intention. You can have the greatest intention in the world, but we also have to think about the impact of that intention. And it is something that has shaped the way I intentionally move forward. And I'm not, I'm human. So there's times where I know that my intention and the impact that it's going to have may not have the healthiest impact, but at least I'm aware of it, and I understand it, because sometimes there's that little bit of wiggle room that we have to have room for grace to make those little bit of errors, because we're growing, because I think the other piece of it is not punishing ourselves for not showing up perfect. that understanding that it's a journey and it's a process and we've got to get there. So I
Yeah.
guess what the best advice I could offer anybody listening in on this conversation, whether you're a practitioner, whether you're, in the medical field, no matter what place that you're in, and as individuals, I really feel it's about doing the inner work, and the real inner work to understand more of who you are, who you're going to choose to be while you're here, whether, purpose, it could be being the best mother that you can be. It doesn't, whatever you choose, but it comes with that level of awareness and that level of work. And I feel that when human beings as practitioners, when we can get people to that place where they have an inner fulfillment of representation of who they are in their soul, they know who they are and they know how to put forth that individual, yourself, into this world and exist in this world, we start to affect social change, is my belief. And you don't have to be a practitioner to be able to walk alongside someone to help them understand their value, their worth, their becoming comfortable with the truth of who they are, and everything else will start to line itself up in the process. And I think that that is the creation process for me. I think that when we talk about the wealth and we talk about the abundance, I guess it's understanding that we are all made, to some people are acquiring it for a bigger purpose to be able to affect social change in a different way, because not everybody's thinking about the big structures and the big infrastructures. So it's respecting what we're called and why we're called to do it and trusting it at the same time.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's a mouthful.
Totally. Well, and I think that just drives the point that in order for us to really dive deep and do our work, whatever that looks like, is we need to do it with a level of awareness of what's happening around us. And I think that that's a really key point that sometimes, and I think that this is, a factor in having grown up during a certain era too, that some of us believe that, because our intentions are good, that we are doing as much as we can. And I think, my messaging is really to disrupt that, because, our society was built on an uneven playing field, right? Like, we just look at the structures of the way in which our built environment is built for able-bodied people, right? And we look at the way in which the criminal justice system was designed right out of like a history of criminalizing Black people. And so I can name example after example, right? Like, the employment system is not designed for working mothers, right? Like, there's always a hard choice to be made. We are, we're not at a point where we can actually achieve professional development for the most part at parity with men. And statistics will show this, right? I'm not just saying this because I feel this way. And so
Well, just look
I
at
think
it from the Canadian perspective and the US perspective. 6 weeks, you're back at work.
yeah,
And
yeah.
on the Canadian side, we have the opportunity to take a year and a half off work. Like, right there, it's not,
Exactly. And
right.
I think in order for us to actually see change happen, that we need to take deliberate steps to disrupt the way in which things are. And so for us to just sit back and say, well, you know what, I don't discriminate against people who have disability. I like, or I don't see color, or I don't see race, right? To make those kinds of comments is not actually acknowledging that we all have a role and a responsibility to play to get everybody to the same place. We're all holding each other's hands to get to the same place at the end of the day, regardless of what your belief system is, right?
Well, it's interesting. So I'm going to take it because I am a complete energy person and I am a manifestation person. And I can't deny that aspect of it. And I think that it kind of contradicts itself and I catch myself contradicting. And this is the work. This is where you have to really understand when they talk about being in alignment is with your body, mind, and spirit are all in agreement at the same time, but we contradict ourselves when, on one hand, we want to see peace and harmony in the world, but how are we contributing? We have to take a hard look at some choices, lifestyle changes, some decision-making process in our own personal life without, for somebody like myself that can't look at the big picture because I get too overwhelmed, but it's making those little lifestyle changes, those little decisions that aren't going to contradict that desire to see more peace and harmony and equality and equity in this world. And that's, it's easy for me just to say it like that. And the reality is it's not that easy to recognize. It's pretty challenging to understand and to code. And I think that the easiest way for anybody out there listening, especially the practitioners, I hold the practitioners very accountable to really taking the time to do their own work, to be able to show up, to be able to help whoever's coming into their life, to choose you to help them heal. It's really important that you're doing the work. But I think the piece that I can gift to anybody out there is that inner work piece. The cornerstone of anything that I've done is, for my own spiritual upbringing, was, seek ye the kingdom of God and all will be added to you. And my takeaway from that was study thyself, know thyself, understand thyself, unlock the window to your soul, and everything will be okay. So I think that there is instructional pieces that we are to do this work. And then when we do the work, then we can have energetically manifestation, alignment, peace, harmony, all the rest of it. Then we can unconsciously and consciously affect change in this world.
Yeah, well, and I think that it's a great point that you make about alignment, because I think that we underestimate our ability to tap in to the deep knowledge of our heart and our soul, right? That is what the mind knows what it knows. The body knows what it feels, but we can't interpret if we're not attuned to the heart. And the heart and the soul are attuned to this world, right? And so I will obviously give a nod to indigenous traditional methods of healing that are so completely aligned with Mother Earth, with the elements around us, with, the natural sources of medicine around us, animals, all of those things. And I think for us to then think that we can know alignment without knowing the detrimental impacts that what we want will have on the earth, I think part of that mismanifestation is really about not actually then attuning, right? I think our souls and our hearts, and our bodies know the language of this earth. And if we are not well attuned to that, then, I can't tell you how many people I see practicing, various methods of manifesting, but being completely unaware that their $7 lattes every single day are accumulating garbage that are really detrimental to this world, right? And so you cannot create this symmetry without it having a bigger acknowledgement of everything within our world and also the universe. And so that's why I'm saying it's much more complex than I think we make it just about aligning yourself with what you want and putting post-it notes and reminding yourself that this is what you want. And it's first of all, there's massive equity dimensions, but then there's also I really, really appreciate all that we've been given from, traditional indigenous ways of knowing and being that really, really honor and account for the land that we're on and the world that we live in. And so I think we're missing the mark in very big ways. Yeah. And so it's much more complex. And that's why I'm saying, going back to the personal healing really has to be grounded in much more than just what we want. And I think that's a knee-jerk reaction to all that we have been socialized to believe we are, and not actually grounded in this real connection with soul and mind and body.
Right. And it's interesting because I just have to put it out there because I have a vision board. Okay.
Vision boards are cool. And
So
I'm okay with sticky notes. I'm not saying anything wrong with it. I'm just saying,
I love it. Love it. Yes,
let's expand.
right.
Let's call people in on that too, right? I think part of it is just calling people in, calling our communities in, and being a part of that manifesting together. Because I can't, and I don't know if this is a personal thing, but I can't want something for myself without knowing that everybody else is also going to get something or is going to be okay because of that. Like, it's just,
it's going without saying, right? And at least for me, because the whole reason of my manifestation is obviously doing what I'm doing. It's interesting when you bring it back to nature and healing. And I remind people that as human beings, we are nature. When we die, we fertilize the earth. And I remember making, and that, I fall off and I go up and down and out there. And it's just about reminding myself in the moments when I'm eating out of alignment of my soul, of being nature. And I'm eating a lot of preserved foods, and no judgment to anybody out there eating preserved foods or anything like that, because we're all working to the best that we can. And I support you guys, like everybody out there. But for me, it touched on my heart one day when I was like, I have a social responsibility to myself, my children, the future generation, to eat well, because they had posted this article that when humans are dying, we're not only are we embalming ourselves and preserving our bodies for 100 plus years, but we are eating so much preserved foods that we're not decomposing. So I was weird. Like, isn't it crazy? So when I like those thought-provoking things that say, So I remember saying, well, I want to do something that is not going to have that kind of impact. I want to have a different impact. And it made me very aware of how I was eating. And it, I had a lot of backlash. It's not new for me in my life to have backlash. Right? I had a lot of backlash saying, what do you mean social responsibility? And I understood, 20 plus years ago when I started that process, that we had a responsibility for the future, for ourselves, the future, that we are, it's up to us to be in harmony with nature. Yep. And that's a really big one. And I can say for my own self that when I eat more naturistic, my mind is clear, I'm calmer. Like, there's so many great things that take place. My body feels different when I'm hydrated, because our body's made up of mostly water. So, as much as I'm having this conversation in this moment, it ties into the big social change of us doing our individual work in part to feel good, so that we can help others feel good, that we want to reach out. But when I started to eat all the other foods, it suppressed me. It made me angry. It made me moody. It made me contribute to being short with my kids. And then my kids took that into school and was short with somebody else.
Yeah, exactly.
The impact that had. So I had to start to show up, doing my part the best I could in the moment every day. And I say to people, take it one day at a time. Don't try to make these long term. Take it one day at a time. If hearing this conversation, it's too big, how am I going to affect the communities? How am I going to affect that? How am I going to affect this? And it feels just like to me, it feels too big for me. Make the individualized internal change to come into alignment and in harmony. And yes, your goals, my goals will be different. Your desires, my desire will be different. But I like the way you said it, as long as it is creating an opportunity that it will contribute for everybody moving ahead.
Yeah. And you know what? I just want to echo that this work is really a practice, right? Like, there's no perfecting it. Like, that's a necessary point of validation. Yes. There's also no end, like there's no end point. We're not going to get to a point and say, I got it, I'm doing it right, and now I'm just going to sail through this. Like, the whole point is trial and error and trial and error, and we're going to feel like we're not doing it properly. And in fact, one of the like one of the tenets of like colonialism and white supremacy is this idea of perfectionism, that, you know, we have to do things perfectly. We're more civilized a society when we do things right the first way. It's actually a very toxic trait that we carry with us, and that's been, you know, socialized and passed on for generations. Is this isn't about, we're not perfecting anything, nothing. This is like a layering, and this is just a constant point of, you know, moving in a direction that feels right, that feels more inclusive, that feels more whole. And that's a for sure. And so I
Right.
know that some people get bogged down with, you know, just not feeling like they're doing it right. And it's just
Right.
like there's no because it's so individualized, that there isn't going to be a benchmark that we can all hold ourselves to.
Right.
It's just
And it's a point that you say about inclusion and community. And I say to everybody, you know, does this mean, you know, when I hear that, does it mean we run into communities or run into and start to do this with everybody and working? And I say to people, what you do is you start by creating your community support system of the people around you where you do the work. And this is where the energy comes into play. This is where you're moving in the direction of where you want to be. So right now I have, you know, a community of people around me. We're together, we are doing this work, we are having the conversations, we are asking the key questions, we are supporting each other and holding each other accountable, but giving that real space for us to cry, to fall, to get back
yeah,
up, and be
yeah,
supporting each other. And as we continue to do that inclusively with everybody, it that energy expands. So if anybody knows anything about energy, and as you feel good about having that support system, that's going to, that energy, that heart energy is going to filter and ripple through. And that's the manifestation process. And as you feel good, you are going to feel abundant, you are going to attract more good things into your life and all the rest of that fun stuff. So it's expansive, right?
exactly. Yeah, and it grows organically, right?
Yes, I love
It's I agree with you. Like the contrary of this work is like stepping into somebody else's community and saying I want to help. Like that's no, like no.
it.
Start where you are in your own community. And if you find that you are predominantly surrounded by a lack of diversity, then, you know, there are some hard questions to ask there, right? Because, you know, we can't really learn without being led by other people's experiences. And so that I think there's something there with that. But definitely like starting in our own communities, with our neighbors and with our families, and really going from there, right? And I think that our families often hold the most friction for us. And I think sometimes I idealize I like this idea that it would be so easy to help other people, and then we're stuck in these like toxic patterns with our own families. And I think that that's a really like poignant like reality, that it's like, oh no, this is where you start, right? You have these patterns that need to be broken. I can see that clear as day. We're born into, or we have these relationships with people that we first and foremost can heal and remedy before we even try to acknowledge that there are all these other bits and baubles around us that we need to address and stuff.
Right,
So
right. So guys, we have 1 minute left. So Sylvia, thank you very much for joining us today and having this
so
discussion.
nice. It's
We
always great to
we could
chat with
be
you.
here for hours. The two of us could be here
And
for
we
hours.
have.
Subject and really asking ourselves how, and it's always that question of how. You know, when we bring it back to, it seems overwhelming, and we just have to continue. You know, as long as we're asking the questions and we're open in that willingness to be a part of the change, it will show up, and we will be guided and led as to the next move and the next move and the next move.
I
And
agree. And it's really about intention, integrity, and
yeah,
alignment, right? And if we stay
absolutely.
focused on those key pieces, then I think that we will be guided towards those next steps.
Absolutely, yes. So thank you guys for joining us here this evening. If you are looking for somebody to support you on how you can be a part of the change, or if you're looking to do your own healing or own inner self work, feel free to visit TanyaRicketts.com to find out more how you can get the support that you need. In addition, feel free to follow Tanya Talks 4 on Instagram and follow Tanya Talks on Facebook, tanyatalks.ca, where you can find out about future conversations as well. All right, until next time, join us on Wednesday, where we will continue our panel discussion on the decision with Abdul Al-Janabi and Teresa Simpatico. So join us on Wednesday at 7 o'clock in the evening. Until then, guys, be well, be safe, and be healthy. Good night.
Night.